Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next session of the day. We are very, very lucky to have Douglas Kent here he's flown in all the way from the States. I think he's in Chicago at the moment. I saw he was in Boston. Even in times of no travel, Douglas still manages to travel. So I think he'd get very bored being in one place at the same time. Now, those of you who've come to SAPICS conferences regularly, you'll know Douglas well, and you'll know what an incredibly bright person he is, and how his knowledge of supply chain management it's huge. The breadth is enormous. He's got a new role from where he was last year, and it's a very grand title. He's now the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Alliances at ASCM. So Douglas has gone green in color. He still loves blue for SAPICS. And is still a great friend. His big responsibility at ASCM is to look after the global partner ecosystem, which in English means that he's got to love, cherish, and adore partners like SAPICS and other stakeholders at ASCM. So we're always delighted to have him. Please remember, if we've got time, ask questions. We'll field them as best we can. And I hope Doug's going to hang around for a little bit just to answer some questions with you all afterwards. So enjoy the presentation. I know that you will be stimulated and learn something. So over to you, Douglas.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. And just to double check, everyone can see the slides. All looking good?
You can see them.
Okay, perfect. So I'm sure you know, thank you, Jenny, first of all, and thanks for inviting me back. I'm sure you all know a little bit about ASCM, of course, founded back in 1957, 45,000 professional members, over 100 training partners, of course, and SAPICS being one of those. ASCM itself was launched as 2019, and of course, we continue to drive the force for certifying supply chain professionals across the globe. We are headquartered here in Chicago, where I am at the moment, as Jenny mentioned, where we have 100 staff that supports the organization. So just moving on from there, of course, what we're faced with today is just this incredible, it's a storm actually, of just macro level forces, which are really challenging our supply chain every single day. The coronavirus, of course, being one of those, the pandemic has certainly helped to illuminate some strategic and operational problems that supply chains are suffering from today. I don't think necessarily we can blame it on the pandemic itself, but one thing we have learned is that perhaps the level of supply chain resiliency that we had hoped for, quite honestly, isn't really strong enough to weather the storms that are ahead. And these macro forces really are diversified and each create a different challenge, whether it's climate change. We certainly saw a great deal of tariff and geopolitical events which have challenged supply chains. Every single week, we see disruption occur from cybersecurity and breaches in data. So all of these kinds of macro factors, again, just continue to illuminate the need for increasing the level of supply chain resiliency, which is required. And I would argue to say this is the new norm. With that in mind, ASCM built a collaboration with the Economist Intelligence Unit to really study this aspect of supply chain resiliency. And we put together a list of panelists and interviewees and invited companies to participate in this initial study, which we launched in October of 2020. And it revealed a number of vulnerabilities that companies have themselves stated as things that they need to focus on, things that they need to fix. One of the first questions that was asked there is, with all of these potential macro threats, right, that we talked about just a moment ago, what are the risks that are most likely to cause severe supply chain disruption in the short term over the course of the next 12 months. And again, you see a lot of these are really quite diverse. Of course, it's no surprise. Pandemics top the list. And of course, if we had done the same survey 3 years ago, it probably wouldn't have even made the list. But of course, it's there now. Then we see these cyber attacks, as I mentioned, of course, concerns around data protection, etc. And then all these other things like market demand shifts, the natural disasters, again, geopolitical instability, labor costs rising, etc. But it's just a multitude of potential threats that could disrupt the supply chain. But then even more importantly, we said or asked the question, and the participants told us, what are their main objectives with regards to their supply chain strategy? So what strategies do they have? The first, of course, was increasing sales growth. The second was increasing customer satisfaction. And surprisingly enough, the third is increasing the level of supply chain resiliency. Now, that's a great aspiration. The question is, how do we actually do that? And what are the vulnerabilities that do exist in terms of achieving excellence in supply chain resiliency? So the study was broken into two different pieces. The first piece was on the strategic aspect, the second on the operational aspect. So in the operational aspect, we looked at really the supply chain's ability to sort of bounce back, to recover from when one of these disruptive events does occur, and you need to get back to whatever the new norm is, to some form of normal state of affairs. You know, what is keeping us from doing that? How well can we achieve this bounce back to a normal state? And the second on the strategic aspect is how do we bounce forward? So if there is going to be a new norm, how do we adapt to that? How do we fundamentally change the organization to become more resilient so that in essence, we're able to live in the new normal and not try to go back to what we thought was the normal state of affairs? And this is, of course, what's happening today. This is the discussion that's happening at the C-suite level today. And really asking the question is, if we don't know what the new norm is, how do we set ourselves up for success? We don't have the crystal ball, or if we have a crystal ball, it's quite cloudy. And when we look into it, we don't know what the next thing is going to happen. We don't know if there's going to be a resurgence of the pandemic. We don't know if the transportation disruptions that we're facing globally are going to continue. We don't know if these costs that we're now seeing escalating of container shipments from China to the US, for example, have increased 9x from what they were 2 years ago, right? We don't know if there's going to continue to be a semiconductor chip shortage. We don't know if we're going to have commodity concerns on metals and lumber, for example. So there is no new normal. So how can we protect ourselves in terms of the resiliency to ensure that when a disruption of any kind, macro or micro, occur, that we're setting ourselves up for success? And this is in essence, what we looked at relative to the benchmark. So on the operational side, broken down into what is considered level 2 capabilities, and they're around position and prepare, sense and plan, and mitigate and respond. And I'm going to drop that down to another level in a moment so you can see what falls beneath these categories. On the strategic side, it was really around leading, building, and transforming. Again, trying to be able to protect ourselves or set ourselves up for success as it relates to whatever that new normal might be. So let's dig down into what the highlights from the benchmark actually revealed to us. And we're going to take each one of these and talk about not only what these highlights are, but what are best practices that need to get put in place in order to take these vulnerable aspects of our supply chain resiliency and turn them into a competitive advantage. The first of the highlights, and I'm almost exhausted about talking about this, but it still seems to be the case that we have a total lack of visibility as we go deep into our supply chain, upstream and downstream. We have no visibility to transactional information. We have no visibility to the potential of risks occurring. Perhaps the best example is how well do we understand the footprint, for example, of our tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supply base. This leaves us quite vulnerable to the dynamics that could occur and some unexpected risks. We can't manage what we can't see. We can't control it if we don't have visibility into the supply chain in terms of what's really happening. This has been a problem for a long time. The second of the highlights also revealed that we still have a very strong dependency in order to increase resiliency based upon the relationships that we build with our key suppliers. Are we a good customer to our suppliers? Are we doing everything we can that we're not just looking at our suppliers as a vendor, someone we negotiate price with, but really to participate as partners as we go forward? Are we building the strength in that supplier relationship management to ensure our resiliency will be lifted because of those relationships? So when something unexpected happens, when a disruption occurs, our suppliers are right there with us, help us out from the situation. The third is really very much tied to resiliency, and that is our business continuity. So when a disruption occurs, do we already have established plans for what we're going to do, how we're going to react, how we're going to motivate our teams to move in a different direction? Do we have playbooks which are established for continuity to ensure that the impact is lessened because we already know what our reaction is going to be? Do we built the scenarios to develop the plans and the playbooks necessary to get us out of the disruptive environment? And the fourth is very disappointing. We still do not have the sustainability aspects, the concern around climate and ecological built into our supply chain. And I'm going to talk further about this because this one is so disappointing that we have this aspiration to be responsible to our environment, while at the same time, we haven't been able to figure out how to operationalize that into our supply chain. It's great to have the aspiration to say we're going to be a responsible player in this world, but if we can't actually bring that down to a policy and a process inside the supply chain, then it remains an aspiration and not a result. So let's look at some of the best practices across each of these highlights. So let's start first with the operational side. Remember, I said that those are broken down: position and prepare, sense and plan, mitigate and respond. And you can see some of these operational capabilities. You see supply chain risk, of course, appearing in terms of our ability to manage risk and how we can do that. What's the maturity level of our ability to manage risk? And do we have the talent to do that? Do we know how to build an enterprise risk system? You see, of course, end-to-end transparency appearing. You see some key metrics like liquidity and leverage ratios. You see on the sense and plan side, again, visibility reappearing in terms of information flows. You see monitoring systems around risk planning, that scenario planning. You see the supplier collaboration that I was speaking of earlier. And then on mitigate and respond, you see, again, some key metrics like our built-in redundancy, you see agility appearing in terms of a responsiveness. These are key attributes for the supply chain that become very important for us. Again, we'll return back to these sort of level 3 categories because they clearly, some of these will tie right back up to the highlights that we saw earlier. On the strategic side, of course, what we see here, lead, build, and transform. So do we have the right leadership? Do we have the right corporate and board level commitments and engagement that's necessary for us to actually have resiliency built in? Resiliency is a tough thing because whenever we think about risk mitigation, it's like every time you pay your insurance bill, right? And you're spending money to avoid cost, right? Cost avoidance spend is always a difficult thing, right? How much do we spend in terms of potential mitigation efforts for risks that we think could occur in order to lessen the impact of those? This is always a difficult equation. And so the success of that is very dependent upon the top-down leadership. Again, building, do we have the right relationships, not only on the supplier side, but also on the customer side? And then, of course, the heavy dependency to build strategic capabilities by having the right talent, the right workforce to be able to lead us into the next generation of that new normal. And then on the transform side, again, here's where you see that those aspects of environmental and circularity come into place. And also things like, again, strategic risk mitigation. And of course, how well are we doing in terms of innovating across our supply chain? So now you understand the structure of the things that we looked at relative to the assessment. Now let's talk about, again, those highlights and what are some best practice to achieve. So I've kind of tried to connect the highlight to the areas where they appear because it's a one-to-many relationship. So when we think about this first highlight of supply chain visibility, again, this is that total lack of visibility that we've been suffering from forever that we just can't see inside of the supply chain. And you see that appear from end-to-end transparency on the operational side and that information flow, as well as to some degree supply chain innovation, because there's innovation that is necessary to enable our ability to have supply chain visibility. So, of course, as we talked about, part of that is that supplier criticality, being able to see risk that could be identified early, but we need to be able to see into our supply base. We need to have critical suppliers already pre-identified, not just tier 1 suppliers, but tier 2 and even down to tier 3 if you're a manufacturer, right? To really understand, of course, the vulnerabilities that could exist because of our selection of suppliers and our suppliers' suppliers and our suppliers' suppliers, right? This becomes very important. And then, of course, real-time visibility, making sure that on the demand and the supply side that we have a data exchange with key partners where our systems are integrated. Latent data doesn't help with visibility. We can't run scenarios with data which is aged, which is latent. We need to have real-time information in order to build scenarios so we can enable decision-making. And that enablement piece, that innovation piece is just so critical, right? To be able to use the information, we're oftentimes data rich, but we're information poor. We have so much data, but we're not able to analyze the data to turn that into really prescriptive analytics to help us make those rapid decisions which are necessary. And of course, we have the controller aspect, which is really that technology which allows that end-to-end visibility and helps us drive success by being able to access information from trading partners, both the supplier and the customer side. And one thing we certainly have seen is during the pandemic period, we just saw this massive acceleration in digital transformation. And the great part about that is it allows us to be able to rethink what we do. Digital transformation is not about automating processes. It's about really thinking how we use digital capabilities to transform the way we do things, not just to do the same things faster. This is not a play simply for productivity. It's really rethinking the way we do things. This, of course, puts a lot of pressure in one of the other areas, because digital transformation is great and we've accelerated that level of investment. Now we need the workforce to catch up with that. And of course, this is a critical aspect as well. On the second highlight, this is that strategic supplier relationship. Again, we see this appear both on the operational as well as the strategic side. So companies are really looking to try to build resiliency by increasing the strength of the relationships with their key suppliers. We already saw in highlight number 1 is we need to identify who those key suppliers are, tiers 1, 2, and 3, but also now we need to do more with them. We need to share information. We need to participate in joint decision-making processes, right? Not to do those in isolation. We need to have risk and reward sharing agreements with our key suppliers so that we're in the game together. And we need to make those strategic investments in inventory. And that's a very interesting concept right now, because one thing that we certainly have seen is that we have really changed our perspective across all industries relative to our view of inventory. So resiliency, of course, can oftentimes be funded by inventory. So we've seen a massive move from a just-in-time inventory play to a just-in-case. So moving from JIT to JIC, right? So we've really seen the view of inventory move from a liability to an asset, right? Because of all of the uncertainty that's occurring. So our view of inventory and how we strategically set these inventory levels has become crucial. It's a great resiliency play with inventory, but it's also an expensive one. So you have to do it carefully. And of course, on the supply side, we can talk about all other kinds of mechanisms to be able to assist with that. So of course, from the very design-in aspect is making sure that critical bill of material items are not sourced to a single source of supply. And can we identify multiple sources of supply and or put into place some flexible contracting to ensure we have some flexibility in terms of our ordering? We can have some additional agility in terms of change orders and delivery schedules and things of that sort, building in this sort of flexibility aspect, again, from design in all the way through the actual order to cash process. And then, of course, we want the suppliers to participate with us on joint innovations, joint planning initiatives, joint marketing campaigns, joint technology sharing, and of course, keep each other honest by putting together a common performance management system where we can start to together figure out what's working, what's not working, leverage what's working well, and correct any potential things that aren't working quite so well. So again, strategic supplier relationship management. If we take a look at the third highlight is that business continuity planning, that playbook. Do we have this formulated response to something that is already potentially could occur? When we think about this business continuity, it can't be divorced from resiliency because it's intrinsically tied together. Resiliency, of course, is about responding, as we saw before, responding to a potential event to get us back to what is a situation of normal. But we can't try to figure that out when the event occurs. Otherwise, we're going to massively increase the impact that risk event could have on the organization. So again, it's getting that top level sponsorship for this, making sure that risk management and mitigation activities are funded, that we run those scenarios, and that the scenarios are integrated into an S&OP process, right? This shouldn't happen outside of our normal planning. It should be inside of the way in which we plan. Of course, we want those playbooks to really dictate what it is that we would do. If we had robust scenario planning, we can stress test different operational or tactical factors and really say, okay, well, if this happened, this is what we would, and if this happened, this would be the impact. So this is what we'd want to do, right? It sounds easy, but of course, it's got a heavy dependency on ensuring that we have the right information to enable that decision process, that information, as I mentioned before, is real time, so that the scenarios that we're running are not based on latent data. It requires that supplier and customer collaboration because we want them to participate. We might need information for them in order to run the scenarios. And just making sure that, of course, that we're using all the technology capabilities that we have. Again, a heavy dependency on analytics to detect threats, for example, and making sure that we're able to, as much as possible, is to understand the probability of a risk event occurring. Whenever we think about risk, we think about risk in terms of a metric that we use in our language, in our score-based language, which is called value at risk, VAR. And value at risk is the combination of the probability of a risk event occurring times the impact that event could have on our business. And that combination is really important because it gives us the opportunity to monetize a risk event. And if we can monetize it, then we have a much better aspect of saying, okay, well, this is a scenario which could play out. It has a relatively high monetized VAR measure. So we need to play different scenarios out and develop, again, the response to that event occurring. What's the continuity plan? What's the playbook? How are we going to move forward? And the last of the highlights is so depressing. And we're going to talk about this one in a little bit more detail because I want to remind you of really great sets of standards for sustainability that you have access to really, again, test this one out. So here we see, of course, that climate change is really, again, this is that unfortunate dichotomy where we have this great aspiration to be a responsible player based on climate and environmental sustainability and building products with circularity in mind so that they have reuse, repurposing capabilities after the product life cycle has ended. And it's just really depressing to see that some of these best practices, these capabilities are missing. What's super interesting about this one is the fact that, unfortunately, and one of the other questions is when we ask the companies who participate in the benchmark, how do they plan to build additional supply chain resiliency over the long term in the next 3 to 5 years? Look what tops the list. Making the supply chain more socially and environmentally sustainable. So again, they're saying on one hand, we're really not mature in this, but yet we have this very strong aspiration and dependency on supply chain resiliency, building resiliency, by ensuring that our supply chain is socially and environmentally sustainable. So what does that tell me? It tells me that we have an aspiration, but we haven't figured out how to operationalize that into our business. And that's exactly the reason that we developed the ASCM Enterprise Certification. So this is our new enterprise certification for sustainability. It's a certification not at an individual level, but at a company supply chain level. It helps us measure exactly what that previous slide was telling us, which is I need to be able to measure not only my economic sustainability, but my degree of social responsibility and my degree of ecological stewardship, right? And what the certification process helps to unveil is where are those weaknesses, right? Where are my policies and my processes and my talent not stacked up in a line to be able to deliver that aspiration? And that's the reason that we developed this particular certification around sustainability. And you have access to this. So I encourage you, and I put in the presentation link, the access to be able to do two things. You can download the standards. They're completely transparent. So anybody that's attending SAPICS today, you can absolutely take a look at the handbook, which contains the 60 plus criteria set where you yourself can do a comprehensive evaluation across this triple bottom line, across these three dimensions: ethical, economic, and ecological. Of course, we see the heart of the supply in the center of this: plan, source, make, deliver, return, and the results achieved. But taking a look at those aspects across the three dimensions of ethical, ecological, as well as economic. And then, of course, looking at the key enablers to achieve that, from strategic and workforce, technology and knowledge, and overarching governance. And that final layer of the enterprise standards includes the stakeholder engagement, which is necessary as well, not only from suppliers and customers, we are a supply chain after all, but also our community and our government. And again, I remind you, this is free to all SAPICS attendees. So go on, take a look, download the standards. And if you want to do an assessment of how well you believe you are maturing towards the higher level of these standards, in addition to the standards being open source, I offered to you the opportunity to do a self-assessment, right? To see how you stack up, to see where your vulnerabilities in terms of sustainability actually exist. So I wanted to take a slightly deeper dive on that because I think it's super important that you understand that these are available tools to you. And if these are concerns, and if you're like these other organizations who say, I'm going to build resiliency on the back end of being a more responsible player, both ethically and ecologically, then these standards will allow you to do that comparative. Take a look at how well your organization is set up for success relative to sustainability. Again, free enterprise level standards, free assessment on your maturity levels for any of the SAPICS attendees for today. So let's talk about the kind of key takeaways, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes for some additional questions. So again, resiliency remains an absolute critical enabler of supply chain success. It was really illuminated through the COVID-19 experience, but the reality of it is those strategic and operational vulnerabilities existed already. It just helped to illuminate the concerns around that. We had the 4 key highlights from this assessment: that total lack of visibility, leaving us vulnerable because we don't have visibility upstream and downstream. We have companies that are promoting supply chain resiliency by building stronger relationships with their key suppliers. The mature players in supply chain resiliency will already have established business continuity plans and playbooks that will help them, respond more quickly to any range of disruptions that might occur. And we absolutely must take this aspirational responsibility of sustainability into operational supply chain. And we need to make sure that we're factoring that into our plans. So we've done this initial assessment in collaboration with EIU, the results of which I've shared with you, which really further promote the need for us to focus on supply chain resiliency. But you have also the ability to participate in that assessment yourself. So if you want to participate in an EIU study, if you want to do the assessment yourselves, you have the opportunity to do that within your company, and we can help to facilitate that. How that assessment roadmap looks like is, if you would like to see where your vulnerabilities are, and again, this is a self-assessment, right? This is not someone auditing, your processes and procedures. It's your self-assessment. But across all of those blocks and categories for both the strategic and operational, there are a series of questions that the initial participants participated when doing the assessment, and you can do exactly the same thing. All we do is we create a specific link for your organization. You then distribute that link to key participants across your supply chain that you want to complete the survey. Those participants fill out the survey, and then we assimilate those results together, and then we prepare an outbrief. What that outbrief will do is to tell you where your strengths and your weaknesses are. It gives you a start. It helps you understand potentially where your focus areas could be. Again, the great thing about this is that it's free. So why not take advantage, right? Just like accessing the enterprise certification for sustainability standards or doing a maturity assessment there, you can do exactly the same resiliency check. You just download the benchmark to assess your supply chain. Here's the link for that. Of course, you'll have that in the presentation material, but it allows you to be able to access that survey. And of course, we would work with you to create that survey link, get that sent out to the players in your organization, and then incorporate those results and give you that outbrief back. So great discussion, hopefully forthcoming on your ability to assess your own resiliency. But of course, what we continue to see is resiliency is a critical aspect of how we're going to be able to respond to whatever the new norm might be. So if we can, then Jenny, if we have any questions, I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, we have. So well done on your timekeeping as always. Thank you very much. The question I posted, which was, why do you think that companies haven't given the attention to resiliency or resilience that they should? MJ did do a bit of an answer, or she did a good answer, but you answer and then let's compare notes.
Oh, great. Well, I haven't seen MJ's answer, so I'll see how well we line up there. I think it is just a lack of knowing what to do. So unfortunately, we became, a little bit too fat, as we oftentimes say, fat, dumb, and happy, right? So I think in many aspects, we think, we were focused very much on costs. We had this, aspect to drive down inventories, to create just in time and et cetera. And we didn't have the level of disruption occurring so much that really highlighted the additional need for resiliency. It's not to say that companies weren't working on it, but it wasn't always a C-suite topic, right? When disruption has occurred, and then suddenly we see what the impact of not having effectively responded that is, we got some sobering reminders about how strategically this was not being addressed. And I think it takes just a couple of those where now it becomes a C-suite discussion. It becomes a board level mandate. We have a lot of companies that are telling us right now that the board is saying, what's your resiliency plan? Tell me how this is going to work. What's the impact? What's the investment necessary to build redundancy in the supply chain in order to help overcome this? So I think it merely was a lack of attention and a lack of understanding what I could do differently. And I think it just took a couple sobering reminders to bounce that up to the executive agenda.
Yeah, I think there's also, we're all human at the end of the day. And I think that there's just that mentality that, well, it won't happen to me. It will happen over there, and I think that there are dozens of examples in the last 14 months or however wretchedly long it's been in that who'd have thought that we'd have seen America go through what it's gone through and the UK go through what it's gone through, because those sorts of problems didn't happen. to anybody. They didn't happen in the Western world. So I think, it's just been a real eye-opener for all of us that you can never take anything for granted.
Yes, and they're continuing, right? So, and these are not even necessarily pandemic related.
No.
So again, we just continue to see loads of disruptions in all forms.
Mm. Yeah, so MJ's comment was that companies are potentially still managed with a finance mindset first instead of balancing cost and opportunity. And that sometimes inventory may need to be higher than you would like to manage the risk.
Yeah. I can tell you, and we've been tracking some numbers on this, right? So you can just take a look at inventory days of supply of companies that are continuing to ratchet up, right? They're moving, as MJ is highlighting, moving from that that just-in-time mentality to the just-in-case, or treating inventory as an asset, right? If I don't have inventory on a shelf, we did an interview yesterday talking about, what's happening relative to what do we think is going to happen relative to Christmas? And I felt like the Grinch, right? I'm like, things that you want are not going to be on the shelf. Get used to it, right? This is what's going to happen, right? So. Yeah.
So just in the presentation just before with Sneha and Eddie about circular economy, and it's the first time I've sort of heard about JIT has now become JIC, JIC. So I've learned something. Celeste has asked a question, and what are your thoughts on ensuring that suppliers are able to operate profitably, ensuring sustainability while still negotiating the lowest price possible?
Yeah, it's a great question, Celeste. So I think this is really goes to the heart of that supplier relationship, right? I mean, we certainly see in instances where part of the mitigation effort is actually to prop up your supply base, right? Whether that's through mutual investments, in some cases it's through vertical acquisition as well. But it's important that we don't, particularly for those critical suppliers. Again, to MJ's earlier point, if I'm going in with a finance mindset and I'm just looking for a reduction in costs, and I don't have the mindset to say, if I push too hard, I might just push my supplier out of business. This is a massive strategic mistake, right? So again, hand on heart, we need each other. How are we going to play well together? Let's understand the vulnerabilities that exist for both of us, and let's manage that together, not as a vendor-customer relationship, but as partners.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Lots to learn. Anybody else, anything? We've got 1.5 minutes left of Douglas's time. Celeste says, great answer. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And there's lots of little blue thumbs floating up.
I do. I'll just say there's so much available. Please take advantage of it, whether it's downloading the enterprise certification standards or participating in the EIU survey assessment to understand your own vulnerabilities. Please take advantage of that. That's the great thing. Being a partner with Sapix just allows us to extend those capabilities and put them in your hands. So by all means, please do take advantage of that.
That's super. Thank you very much. And yeah, Annette, I concur. Thank you very much indeed. And Douglas, always, it's just so great to have you, I would say, on the stage. It's so great to have you here, in inverted commas, all those sorts of things. But it's just always great to see you, to hear from you, and just to keep catching up with all the stuff that goes on in your line. Not just ASCM, but in the developments that you personally bring with all of this too. So thank you, and keep on learning and keep on sharing.
I promise.
And keep on being brilliant.
Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and I'm looking forward to seeing you live next year.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, and to everybody else, it's now you've got 10 minutes transition time. Well done for keeping on. I hope you all had lots of sugar. I'm just not supposed to say that, am I? You're not supposed to be eating sugar. But thank you very much for your participation in this session, and looking forward to Kristen's session, which is the next one. I promise you that she's fascinating. So the topic is, it's random. It's not random. It makes sense. And you will learn lots and you will be inspired. I certainly am. So I'll see you in the next session, which is the one with Kristen Cox, and then Scott and Greg from Supply Chain Now. So we'll see you. Unfortunately, you're going to be very bored of me by the end of the afternoon, but we'll see you just now in the next session.